Well, the Saratoga Springs History Museum is one of the oldest museums in upstate New York. We were founded in 1883 as the Historical Society of Saratoga, and our mission is to collect, preserve, and exhibit items that relate to the history of the city of Saratoga Springs specifically. The exhibit that we're going to be going through is our orientation exhibit, which tells the story of the city of Saratoga Springs from prehistoric times all the way up through till the 20th century. So the first part of the exhibit that we're going to look at is Saratoga Springs in prehistoric times through the early 18th century. One of the most important things about Saratoga is the spring water. Native Americans had visited here for hundreds of years to drink the spring water because they believed that it had healing properties. There's a spring that was called High Rock Spring, and High Rock was a cone that had built up from mineral deposits. The natives, specifically Mohawks, had come here. They drank the water and also hunted in the area around Saratoga Lake. So in this part of the exhibition we have many artifacts that are related to the Native Americans, some of these dating back almost thousands of years that were found along the lake itself. One artifact that we'd like to show here, it's actually a piece of the deposit from High Rock Spring. If you were to visit the spring today, it looks like a small little volcano, you could say, and that's just a buildup of the mineral springs. Through the 19th century, people would come to visit and they would chip pieces of it away to take home as souvenirs. So this actually is a piece that somebody had as a souvenir, and we were able to get it back and keep it as an exhibit in the museum. So the first permanent settlers in Saratoga Springs were in the 1780s, but the first entrepreneur who we like to say really developed the downtown of Saratoga was Gideon Putnam. Putnam built a tavern and boarding house in the year 1802 on what is now Broadway in Saratoga. And we have one artifact that relates right back to that building that it's my personal favorite in our entire collection. And it's a tavern sign that we have. It was painted by his wife, DeWanda Putnam, in the year 1802. And the sign actually depicts a relative of theirs, Israel Putnam. Israel is hanging upside down in the painting, and it's said that he's going down into a hole where a wolf had crawled down in. The wolf had been marauding sheep in at the town's pastures. He went out with a hunting party, went in with it, shot the wolf, pulled it out with his bare hands. This was so important to the family and also important to the community that at the hometown in Connecticut, there are still historical markers talking about this. And when the Putnams came here, DeWanda painted it and put it on their tavern sign. But that is the first sort of thing you would have seen if you were a traveler coming into downtown Saratoga Springs. Throughout the rest of this early part of our exhibit, we talk about the early settlement of the city, especially the spring waters. This is a portrait of Dr. John Steele, and Steele did the first treatise on the mineral springs of Saratoga. His book was published in 1817. So we actually took samples of many of the mineral springs and analyzed what minerals and the contents each spring had. And it was determined that depending on what your ailment was, you could drink a different spring to try to treat that. You need things to do when you come to Saratoga Springs beside drinking water. So major hotels were constructed. There was an opera house, there were plays, there were dances that you could attend, and also other things that you would do for fun, which might include gambling or watching horse racing. But in this area of the exhibit, we still really focus on the spring water because, after all, that's what we're here for. In this area here, we have some original Saratoga water bottles. One is from Congress Spring. It's still corked off, and it has the original water in it from, I would guess, somewhere around 1870. This stick with the glasses on it is called a dipper. So at the mineral springs, there would be boys and girls who would work. They would put the dipper down into the water, give you a drink, and then you would give them a tip. And we have a photograph here of a dipper boy working at High Rock Spring in the 1880s or so. If you came to Saratoga Springs, the mineral water is always free at the spring, or was always free at the spring. And that was very traditional as a rule that Gideon Putnam had actually started back in the early 19th century. If you were to purchase a bottle of Saratoga spring water, it would have been pretty expensive. And that's something that really put Saratoga on the map, because these bottles of mineral water were shipped all over the world in the 19th century. Most of the springs actually had diuretic properties and would work as a laxative. And that's one thing that went along with 19th century medicine. If you came to Saratoga, you probably weren't coming on vacation per se, but you might come here from the south, or you might come from New York City, and you're going to have a prescription from your doctor. And the doctors actually went and used these analyses of the spring water, like Dr. John Steele's. And they would say, okay, in the morning, you're going to go to, say, Congress Spring and have a drink, followed by a brisk walk. Then you're going to go to High Rock Spring, and then have a brisk walk. And all of this was to try to create a healthy body, but also to alleviate any digestive issues that you might have. All right, so Saratoga Springs had a history of gambling. In the late 19th century, we had here what were called gentlemen gamblers who went to the clubhouses that were owned by some of the wealthiest men in America. After their closures in the 20th century, we have a period where gambling kind of quieted down for a bit, but then by the 1920s and 30s, it picked up, and that's when we like to say the gangsters came into Saratoga Springs. Probably the most famous one to come here was Arnold Rothstein. And he was a young man when he came to Saratoga Springs, and in 1919, he opened a gambling house called the Brook. And the Brook was located a little bit on the outskirts of the city, just past where Saratoga Hospital is today. Rothstein's model was that they would have high-end entertainment in your front rooms, and in the back rooms is where the gambling would actually take place. Gambling was always illegal in Saratoga Springs, but with the clientele that it drew and the money that it brought into the city, everybody looked the other way on this. There was a story on about the Brook, and I believe it's in the 1930s, where there was going to be a police raid. So the police went to the front door around 8 p.m. They knocked on the door and said, "Hey, we have to check the place out." They went into the Brook, they went through, they went room after room and didn't find anything. They finally got to the third floor, and there was a locked door, and the maitre d' who was taking them through said, "Well, there's a little old lady, she's in the room, she's really tired, she doesn't feel well. We would appreciate it if you don't go in that room." So everybody agreed. The police left, and they say within about a half an hour, the place was up and running again, fully operating. So everybody knew what was happening, but these places drew a lot of money into Saratoga. In 1953, the Key Valver investigations were a federal inquiry into gambling and corruption in Saratoga Springs. And that's essentially what shut down all of the gambling here. With the demise of gambling, and then soon after that with the construction of the Northway, or the Interstate 87 that went by the city, tourists no longer had to drive straight through Saratoga Springs. They could easily bypass us to go north up into the Adirondacks. So that's starting to change the dynamic of the city. We had all these massive hotels here that could house thousands and thousands of people, more than we even have today. And all of this started to decline. So by the 1950s, we call this the period of decline in Saratoga. And it really continued up until, I'd say 1966 is a turning point. That's when the Saratoga Performing Arts Center, or SPAC, came in. That brought the New York City Ballet, the Philadelphia Orchestra, and it started to spur a rebirth of the city. And then in 1984, we had a city center constructed. That started to bring in conventions and more tourism. And the rest is history, because the city revitalized itself. And even through the economic decline a few years ago, our city was one of the few in the country that were still growing, and today still is. And now Saratoga Springs is a tourist destination. So we're really proud of how our city has had its ups and downs, but how it's really built itself up to be one of the strongest communities in upstate.